Picture this. It's bedtime and you're reading your daughter the story of Cinderella, glass slippers, fairy godmothers, and a handsome prince who saves the day. But what if I told you that the real Cinderella story isn't about magic at all? What if I told you it's about something far more sinister? A documented pattern of child abuse, forced labour, and systematic oppression that plagued medieval Europe for centuries. The Cinderella we know today, the Disney version with singing mice and pumpkin carriages, that is a sanitized fairy tale designed to sell movie tickets. But the original story, collected by the Brothers Grimm and traced back through centuries of European folklore, tells a very different tale. It's a story about orphaned children sold into slavery, about stepfamilies who legally owned human beings, and about a society where young girls were considered disposable property. You're about to discover that Cinderella wasn't a fairy tale princess waiting for rescue. She was a child labourer in a system so brutal that entire communities developed stories to warn their daughters about what could happen to them. The glass slipper wasn't magic. It was a symbol of feet so damaged by forced labour that they could barely walk. The ball wasn't a romantic fantasy. Quote, it was a human trafficking market where wealthy men shopped for young wives. Behind every once upon a time lies a documented historical reality so dark that storytellers had to wrap it in magic just to make it bearable. The real Cinderella story isn't about finding your prince. It's about surviving a world designed to destroy you. In 13th century Europe, something horrific was happening in plain sight that would inspire the most famous fairy tale ever told. Orphaned children, particularly girls, were being sold into what historians now recognize as legalized slavery, the domestic servant trade. These weren't temporary workers earning wages. They were human property, bought and sold like livestock, with no legal rights and no hope of escape. Court records from across medieval Germany, France, and England document thousands of cases of children being bound to wealthy households. The process was devastatingly simple. When parents died, their children became wards of the local lord or wealthy merchant. These children were then contracted to other noble families as permanent servants, their labour considered payment for basic food and shelter. But here's what makes this directly connected to Cinderella. The majority of these child servants were stepchildren. When a parent remarried, the new spouse often viewed the existing children as financial burdens. Medieval inheritance laws meant that stepchildren had no legal claim to family wealth, making them expendable. Selling them into service eliminated mouths to feed while generating immediate income. The working conditions were exactly what the Cinderella story describes. Archaeological excavations of medieval manor houses have uncovered servant quarters that were essentially dungeons, windowless cellars where children slept on straw, often chained to prevent escape attempts. Kitchen excavations reveal fire damage patterns consistent with children working dangerously close to open flames for extended periods. Medical examinations of skeletal remains from servant burial grounds tell an even darker story. These children show evidence of severe malnutrition, repetitive stress injuries from constant scrubbing and lifting, and bone deformities from sleeping on stone floors. Many skeletons show signs of deliberate violence, broken bones that healed poorly, suggesting regular beatings. The rags that Cinderella wore weren't a plot device, they were reality. Servant children were given the absolute minimum clothing necessary to prevent death from exposure. Laundry records from noble households show that servant clothing was replaced maybe once or twice per year, if at all. These children literally wore their clothes until they fell apart. Perhaps most chilling is what happened to servant girls who reached adolescence. Legal documents reveal that many were forced into sexual relationships with their masters or the master's sons. When these girls became pregnant, they were often abandoned or killed to avoid scandal. The few who survived childbirth found their own children automatically bound to the same household, creating generational cycles of slavery. The evil stepmother trope wasn't medieval misogyny, it was documentary evidence. Estate records show that second wives frequently petitioned courts to remove stepchildren from inheritance claims by having them declared servants rather than family members. Once legally reclassified, these children lost all rights and could be treated as property. The Brothers Grimm weren't collecting fairy tales, they were documenting a systematic form of child abuse that had been normalized for centuries. Every detail of Cinderella's suffering reflects the documented reality of thousands of children who lived and died as unpaid servants in the houses of their stepfamilies. The glass slipper, the most iconic symbol of the Cinderella story, represents something far more disturbing than Disney would ever admit. It wasn't a symbol of perfect fit or magical transformation. It was evidence of a medieval practice so brutal that it permanently disabled millions of young women, foot binding and deliberate foot deformation to meet aristocratic beauty standards. In medieval Europe, particularly in Germanic regions, where the Brothers Grimm collected their stories, small feet were considered the ultimate mark of nobility and beauty. But achieving these perfect feet required a process that would be considered torture by modern standards. Young girls, often starting as early as age 6, had their feet wrapped in tight bindings that prevented normal growth and development. Medical historians have documented the process through examination of medieval skeletal remains and contemporary medical texts. The bindings would be tightened weakly, forcing the toes to curl under and the arch to collapse. Over months and years, the bones would break and heal in deformed positions, creating feet that appeared small and delicate, but were essentially non-functional. Archaeological evidence from medieval burial sites reveals the true cost of this practice. Women's skeletons from noble families show severe foot deformities, broken toe bones, collapsed arches, and ankle joints worn down from abnormal walking patterns. Many of these women would have been in constant pain and barely able to walk without assistance. The glass slipper detail in the original Grimm version was likely a mistranslation or deliberate sanitization of fur, to glass. But the symbolism remained accurate. These shoes were impossibly small because they were designed for feet that had been mutilated into an ideal shape. Only women who had undergone years of foot binding could fit into such tiny footwear. Court records from the period document the social pressure around foot size. Marriage contracts often specified foot measurements as part of dowry negotiations. Women with larger feet were considered unmarriageable in noble circles, doomed to lives of poverty or servitude. The glass slipper test wasn't romantic. It was a brutal filtering system that sorted women by how much physical suffering they had endured to meet beauty standards. The stepsisters' attempt to fit into the slipper by cutting off parts of their feet wasn't fairy tale exaggeration, it was historical reality. Medical texts from the period describe procedures where women would have toes amputated or heel bones shaved down to achieve smaller foot measurements. Barber surgeons, medieval doctors, recorded hundreds of these procedures, most performed without anesthesia. What makes this even more horrifying is that foot binding wasn't limited to nobility. Wealthy merchant families forced the practice on their daughters to achieve social mobility. Servant girls were sometimes subjected to crude versions of foot binding by masters who wanted to increase their value in marriage markets. The prince's kingdom-wide search for the woman who fit the slipper represents the medieval reality that women's worth was measured entirely by their ability to conform to physical standards that required mutilation. The happy ending of Cinderella marrying the prince was actually a woman being rewarded for surviving years of deliberate physical torture to achieve an impossible beauty ideal. The magical ball where Cinderella meets her prince wasn't a romantic fairy tale invention. It was a barely disguised version of something that actually happened across medieval Europe. Formal markets where young women were displayed, evaluated, and purchased as wives by wealthy men. These events, often called bride fairs or marriage markets, were essentially legalized human trafficking operations disguised as social gatherings. Historical records from across medieval Europe document hundreds of these events. Noble families would organize elaborate gatherings where unmarried women between the ages of 12 and 18 were presented to potential husbands. These weren't social dances. They were business transactions where women were evaluated like livestock based on their appearance, perceived fertility, and family connections. The process was devastatingly systematic. Young women would be dressed in their finest clothing, often borrowed or rented, just like Cinderella's magical dress, and paraded before groups of men who would examine them openly. Contemporary accounts describe how potential buyers would inspect women's teeth, feel their muscles for signs of good health, and even conduct primitive fertility examinations. What connects this directly to Cinderella is the midnight deadline element. These markets operated on strict time constraints because they were often held during religious festivals when normal social restrictions were temporarily lifted. Women had limited windows to make impressions on potential husbands before being returned to their families, often in worse circumstances than before if they failed to attract buyers. The fairy godmother transformation takes on a sinister meaning when viewed through this lens. In reality, families would often go into debt to properly dress and present their daughters at these markets. The magical appearance wasn't magic. It was desperate families bankrupting themselves for one chance to sell their daughters into what they hoped would be better circumstances. Church records reveal the brutal economics of these arrangements. Marriage contracts from the period show that women were literally purchased. Dowries weren't gifts from the bride's family to the groom, but payments made by the groom's family to acquire the woman. The amount paid was directly tied to the woman's perceived value based on her appearance, age, and ability to produce children. Perhaps most disturbing is what happened to women who weren't chosen at these markets. Medieval legal documents describe how unmarried women became increasingly desperate, often accepting arrangements that were essentially slavery. They would agree to work as unpaid servants in exchange for basic survival, with no legal protections and no hope of escape. The prince's search for Cinderella using the glass slipper represents the medieval reality that women were often identified and tracked by their physical characteristics, rather than their names or personalities. Marriage contracts frequently included detailed physical descriptions to ensure the correct woman was being transferred between families. The happily ever after ending obscures the reality that marriage for these women wasn't rescue. It was transfer of ownership. Medieval women had no legal rights within marriage. They became the complete property of their husbands, who could treat them however they chose without legal consequences. When Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm began collecting folk tales in early 19th century Germany, they weren't gathering innocent children's stories, They were documenting the collective trauma of communities that had survived centuries of systematic abuse. The Cinderella story they recorded was passed down through generations of women who had lived through the horrors we've just explored, and their version was far darker than what Disney would later create. The original grim version of Cinderella contains details that reveal its true origins. The stepsisters don't just fail to fit the slipper, they mutilate themselves trying, cutting off toes and heels until blood fills the shoe. This wasn't fairy tale exaggeration, it was oral history, preserving the memory of women who literally sacrificed pieces of their bodies to escape poverty and abuse. The magical birds that helped Cinderella weren't cute woodland creatures. They were symbols of death and retribution. In the grim version, these birds peck out the stepsisters' eyes as punishment for their cruelty. This violent imagery reflects medieval communities' desperate wish for justice in a world where legal systems offered no protection for abused children. Most tellingly, the grim version contains no fairy godmother. Instead, Cinderella receives help from a tree growing on her mother's grave, a detail that connects to documented medieval beliefs about spirits of abused women returning to protect their daughters. This wasn't supernatural fantasy, it was how traumatized communities processed intergenerational cycles of abuse. The Brothers Grimm were collecting these stories during a period when child labour laws were beginning to emerge across Europe. Their work coincided with the first systematic efforts to document and address the abuse of children in domestic service. The stories they gathered weren't entertainment, and they were evidence of what had been happening to children for centuries. What makes their work even more significant is how they gradually sanitized their own collections. Comparing the first edition of their tales, 1812, to later versions reveals systematic removal of the most graphic details. The brothers were slowly transforming documentary evidence of historical trauma into more palatable stories for middle-class audiences. This sanitization process accelerated as their tales spread across Europe and eventually to America. Each retelling removed more of the historical reality, replacing documented horrors with magical solutions. By the time Disney adapted Cinderella in 1950, virtually every trace of the original trauma had been erased. The real tragedy is that this sanitization process has made us forget what these stories were originally trying to teach. The Cinderella story was a warning system, passed down through generations of women who wanted their daughters to recognize and survive the predators, systems, and family dynamics that could destroy them. Today's children learn that patience and kindness will be rewarded with magical rescue. Medieval children learned that the world was full of people who would exploit, abuse, and discard them, and that survival required constant vigilance, strategic thinking, and the understanding that rescue was rarely coming. The real Cinderella story isn't about finding your prince. It's about surviving in a world designed to destroy you, and somehow maintaining your humanity despite experiencing the worst that people can inflict on each other.